keynote session featuring Marcus Kwame Anderson and David F. Walker, co-creators of Big Jim and The White Boy. We're honored to discuss their powerful work today, ask some thought-provoking questions, and if time allows, open the floor for audience questions. Thank you all for joining us. I'd like to introduce our awesome co-creators. David F. Walker is an award-winning journalist, filmmaker, and comic book writer, known for co-creating Naomi and Bitterroot. He is author of Eisner Award-winning graphic novel, The Black Panther Party, a graphic novel history, and has written for Marvel, DC, Boom, and Dark Horse Comics. Marcus Kwame Anderson is a Jamaican-born illustrator and fine artist based in upstate New York with a degree in illustration from SUNY Fredonia. He is the illustrator for the Eisner Award-winning graphic novel, The Black Panther Party, a graphic novel history, and co-created the comic series Snow Days. We are here to discuss Big Jim and the White Boy, which is a compelling graphic novel that follows an unlikely friendship between two young men, one Black, one white, as they journey through a racially charged American South. Together, they face danger, confront prejudice, and discover common ground, exploring themes of race, identity, and resilience. So thank you all for coming.
Thanks for
I
having
want to
us.
start out.
Thank you.
I know we don't have a lot of time, so I just want to jump into the questions. My first question for you all is, did you have a clear vision for how you wanted to portray Jim? And what were some of your initial ideas or qualities you wanted to bring to his character?
Yeah, I knew from the very beginning that, one of the things I wanted to do was I wanted to undo a lot of the characteristics that Mark Twain had given Jim in the original book, Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. So I wanted to flesh him out. I wanted to give him more of a backstory, but more importantly, I wanted to like elevate him beyond that sort of stereotype that he was, and place him in a context that was more similar to a lot of the folk heroes that I learned about when I was a kid, whether it was like a Davy Crockett or some of those folks that we would learn about in elementary school. But then I also want to throw in just a little bit of that larger than life black action hero that I also grew up with in the 70s, guys like Fred Williamson, Jim Brown, Jim Kelly. So I wanted to take all of that and create the sort of hero that I always wished that I'd had when I was a kid and when I first was introduced to Adventures of Huckleberry Finn.
Yeah, and Dave and I had a lot of conversations, about all of these things, and obviously as the illustrator, I approached it visually, so I wanted, first and foremost for Jim's, dignity and intelligence and who he is as a person and a folk hero to come through. But, similar to how David was saying, we wanted to make sure he was balanced as a hero and not be so like superhuman that, he wasn't relatable.
Thank you for that. And I think especially through the illustrations and the text, you can see that Jim is a very different person than what we see in the original story. How did you feel about tackling this project as a whole? And what were your main motivations and aspirations for bringing this story to life? Because it's a very different story than the original work.
Yeah, I mean, I was excited from the beginning. This is a project that I'd been thinking about for a very long time. I'd started and stopped, and had actually given up on one at one point. And then the publisher that Marcus and I worked with, 10 Speed Graphic, they published our book, The Black Panther Party. When they were started talking to me about what could possibly be next, this idea sort of came to the forefront, and I was like, yeah, okay, like what could be possibly better than a follow-up to the Black Panther Party, a nonfiction book that's about revolution and about sort of reclaiming aspects of the perception of what it means to be Black in America. And this idea of retelling Adventures of Huckleberry Finn was also about reclaiming that, and it was in its own way was I saw it as being kind of revolutionary, and knew that our working relationship on Black Panther Party was so strong. It's almost like we share a brain, which is kind of scary sometimes. But I was like, man, this is a journey I want to take, and I'd love to take it with this guy who is, like my simpatico, my compañero, and the best collaborator anyone could ever hope for.
Yeah, and for me, it's funny because there's sometimes stories where as a creator, you know ahead of time, like, oh, if I ever get the chance, I want to tell this story. If you had asked me like, 10 years ago, like, are you going to be telling a reimagining of Huckleberry Finn? That wouldn't have been something I would have guessed. But it's like when David, pitched the idea, knowing that it was coming through his, lens and the way that like he views the world and the complexity and nuance that he brings to storytelling. I was like, yeah. And on top of that, like, I think one of the weird things that both David and I share is that, we do like a challenge in like, telling stories and creating. And this, if nothing else, was a challenge, but a good challenge. Like, you know what I mean? Not like a challenge where I was asking myself, why am I doing this? But like a challenge where I'm like, okay, like I know that we want to do this right. I know that we want to not just retread the original book. I know we wanted to give a lot of context to history and storytelling, and so I was up for it, and so I was excited. I was excited when I heard the idea, and knowing that like we were going to be telling this story together excited me even more.
Thank you for that. I think I really keying into what David said about reclaiming, because that's what I see this as. Like the title says reimagining, but I think it really, if you look at it, it really is a reclaiming. And part of that is how you guys depict and reimagine Jim in a way. So my question is like, how is this reimagining honoring who Jim is as opposed to the original work? Like in what ways does this book honor Jim? How and also, what are your aspirations for bringing, but actually, no, sorry. Um, I got mixed up in my questions. What inspired
Okay.
your approach to this work? So first, how did your depictions and reimaginings honor Jim, and what inspired you to approach it in this way?
Well, I would say more than anything was the opportunity to give Jim a level of dimension and complexity that he never had in Mark Twain's original book or any of the movies or other adaptations of that book. So it was really about giving him some humanity, which when you look at so many depictions of enslaved people, and not just enslaved folks, but Africans and the descendants of Africans living here in America, so much of that is devoid of humanity, right? Like that's one of the original sins of this country, is that it was founded on this idea of, if we take the humanity away from this group of people, it's okay to enslave them if they're less than us, if they're inferior. And it was the same thing with the genocide of the indigenous people who were here before the colonists came. And so to me, this book was always about, as the descendant of people who were enslaved and who studied this history for many years, I know that like how much of that is missing, how much of our humanity is missing, even in our day-to-day experience, right? I felt that growing up. I was always made to, not always, but I was often made to feel inferior to other people, and made to feel like I was less than simply by virtue of, the melanin in my skin. So a lot of this, and a lot of all the work that I do is really about, again, the reclamation of this humanity, or not even reclamation, it's like a declaration of humanity.
Yeah, definitely. And again, speaking artistically, the original illustrations for the original novel, were done by E.W. Kemble, who was, he was an illustrator. And in addition to illustrating storybooks, like The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, he also did a lot of pretty vile stereotype based caricature drawings of Black people. And, they were very much in line with a lot of the minstrel depictions of the time, and so there were two things happening, with the original publication. There was the fact that for all of Mark Twain's good efforts, which he did have, like he was writing of a time and a place, coming from a family that had enslaved Africans. So there's a certain complexity there. But so what you're dealing with is on a writing level, like David said, Jim is largely unexplored, and who he is and what his motivations are largely unexplored. And then just visually, he's also was depicted in a way that's really in line with a lot of the negative, harmful, minstrel type depictions. So, early on in the book, and we see some images on the screen right now, because like at the beginning of the book, we intentionally opened with style that's more reminiscent of coming straight off of the page of Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, the original novel, and then we jump right into our story and our world, and we take that same scene where Huck and Jim find the boat, and that's pretty much the only place in the book where we really come straight from the original story. We use the original story as a contrast point. So, to answer your question, like it felt really important to give Jim a lot of depth in every way, like his interiority, who he is, and also even just how we visually depict him as well.
Thank you. I really feel like when you go from those two slides, it's almost like the lights turn on. And we get to see the real story. So black and white, this is like just not real, or this is different. And as soon as you switch, the characters will come alive, the action, it was a really great device that you guys portrayed there. And speaking of humanity and looking at how I don't I after reading the book, I feel that there was humanity given and provided for both characters, right? It wasn't just we're gonna shine this light on Jim. I think there was also a light that was shined on Huck as well, which um, I'm grateful for. And my question for you guys now is, speaking about humanity and bringing things to light, how how do you envision this book helping readers find healing and or understanding? And were there aspects that you feel address a deeper societal issue, or do they address some personal wounds or things that we brought up? I know, David, you mentioned how you were made to feel when you were younger, but how is this book helping people find healing?
It's a great question. I think that you know, we talk about this in the book itself, and what this book is about is telling the story, making sure the story gets told. It's this running theme, that if you don't get to tell your story, one of two things is going to happen: either no one's going to tell it and then you just sort of disappear, or someone's going to tell it the wrong way, and then the truth of you and your existence and your time here on this in this existence is becomes false. And so, that to me was something that I was always fascinated with, even as a kid. I mean, I remember, the very limited lessons we learned in school about like the history of slavery and the history of civil rights and all that sort of stuff. And none of those stories ever included my family. They were really generalized, and it was as if it glossed over everything. And then as I grew older and I, found out the things that my grandparents and my parents did during the civil rights movement, and then found out about my great grandparents and their experiences as enslaved individuals in Virginia. It really got me to thinking about like this idea that everybody has a story to tell, everybody's story is worth telling, and if nothing else, that sort of that's the driving theme of this book, is that we all have stories worth telling, and they should be known because we're all connected in one capacity or another. There was how many, tens of thousands of people marched on Washington, D.C. in 1963, in the March on Washington, and yet we only know a handful of the people who were there because we've seen the pictures and we've seen Dr. King's speech. But there were so many thousands of people that were part of that movement, that were part of all sorts of things. History and the big moments of history are made up of smaller moments and anonymous people. And that was sort of what was coming through when I was doing research on our Black Panther Party book. It was like, okay, everybody knows Huey Newton and everybody knows Bobby Seale and Angela Davis and Elaine Brown, but what about the regular people, as they call them, the rank and file members who prepared the meals for the free breakfast program, right? Like their stories are as important as the people whose names have been immortalized by history.
Yeah, definitely. And I think when we think about all of the divisions and the inequity and iniquity in our world, right? Like at our core, we're all human, right? And all of these systems, whether it's patriarchy, white supremacy, all the systems that harm people, they are man-made constructs. That being said, it's not like we can opt out of them and imagine that they don't exist.
Mhm.
So for me, one of the remedies to that, and I would say it works on a personal level, because I would say one has to be open to empathy, to really have the type of healing and, you know, reconciliation, inside that we would like to come out of people reading this book. But if you approach the world with empathy, if you approach the art that you take in with that place and that openness, I really think there's a lot in this book, for people. I won't spoil it, but the theme that, was mentioned earlier about telling one story and the importance of telling one story, like we really bring that theme together at the end of the book in a way that I think anybody, again, who is an empathetic being, with an open mind, can relate to. And I would argue that it would really help you um, see the points of views of others, and also the relationship between Jim and Huck in our story. I love that because Jim obviously is the center of our story and he's the core. But as you mentioned before, we do add depth to Huck, and we their bond is super important. You see them, throughout the book, aging to be old men in their 90s and 100, and there is there's something beautiful about the connection between them. And I can't spoil things, but there are aspects of Huck's story that make him, even more complex than the original text. So I just think, everybody open your hearts, open your mind. And look, empathy is a good thing for us to have in this world, period, especially at this particular moment that we're speaking. So, bring that to the pages of Big Jim, and I think that you will have an incredible experience.
Thank you. I think also, being a previous English teacher and high school librarian, I think having this book in schools, thinking about empathy and trying to instill empathy in our students is super important. So thank you guys for that. And I think having teachers and librarians use this book in their classes and in their libraries would be super helpful. And it also, I think, helps us see ourselves in a different way. And it helps tell our story, or it gives us, for people who can't relate to who Jim is, it helps them see life through his experience. So thank you guys for that. As I was reading this book, I kept on coming back to the title. So reflecting on the original title and its meaning, how did you guys land on Big Jim and the White Boy? What message or tone did you want to convey from the jump?
I wanted something that would catch people's attention, whether that was from a positive standpoint or a negative standpoint. I wanted something that when people saw it, along with whatever image we had, they would go, "What is this about?" And we were last month, Marcus and I were at New York Comic Con. We were sitting at the booth and at our publisher's booth, and we saw people walking by, and it was always like a and then they would pick it up and then they would buy it. And it was like, I didn't want, I wanted it to have a certain amount of, just enough kick to it that people would go, and then that there would be other people who would be potentially offended by it, right? Like it's in a lot of ways it's like Public Enemy's album, It Takes a Nation of Millions to Hold Us Back, right? Like that, when you really think about what that title says, like it says so much, but there's some people who would disagree with it, right? There's some people
Hmm.
who would say, oh, they're being there, that's some militant stuff or whatever. And so, you know, I wasn't going to push for anything more controversial in the title. It kind of went back and forth between, do we call him Black Jim or Big Jim? And Black Jim felt too much, like we were pushing too hard. So yeah.
Now I want to know what other controversial titles were on the table. Um, but I think we have a question from the audience I'm going to ask you guys.
Yep.
Twain's work has come under increased scrutiny, not just for its portrayal of Black characters, stories, but specifically for its language and use of what we now consider offensive terms and linguistic tropes. How do you deal with language and speech as an aspect of character in this book? What were you hoping to achieve with that?
I was hoping to achieve a level of honesty that um, I think some of the linguistic choices that Twain made were based on sort of the minstrel aspects of the time. But I also think the one word that everyone's really wondering about, the N word, is like as American as apple pie. And it's part of the ideology in which this, what I call the original sin of America, was founded on. And so we discussed how to make sure that we didn't lose sight of that in the book. At the same time, I didn't want that word staring at anybody throughout, as they turn the pages. But um, to erase that word, and I mentioned this in the introduction to the book, to erase that word does not erase the meaning or the ideology that has allowed it to thrive for hundreds of years, right? Like we see it now. Most people aren't coming out and saying the N word in public, but they're thinking it, right?
Hmm.
And so was that supposed to make me feel better that they're not, the same people that were lynching folks, the same people that were protesting Ruby Bridges. Today is the anniversary of Ruby Bridges integrating, school.
Mm.
Um, those same people, they still exist, right?
Hmm.
They're using different language, but and so to me, I wanted this to be true to that some of that era. And so we still use the word. You just have to look at the book or read the book to see how we use it. Um, and in Percival Everett's book, James, he really does a great job of playing with the idea that enslaved Africans and their descendants really spoke two languages in this country. They
Yeah.
spoke the language that they expected white people to speak, expected them to speak, and then they spoke the language that they could use in private. It was, and W.E.B. Du Bois talks about the double consciousness of blackness in America, and that's what struck me about James, is that double consciousness, is that code switching. And so we play with that even in the book. We show that 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 the existence of black folks in America is about how do you survive America.
So true. Thank you for that. And also thank you for mentioning that you talk about the language in the author note. I was gonna say that one, super helpful, the author note, and then people who haven't read it or haven't looked at the back are all of these different resources, which I think really help especially again, high school teacher, helps get kids and students involved and immersed in the text, which I think is super important. We're running short on time, and I'm very upset about that. But my last question is, if you could sum up this book in 4 words and 4 individual, it's not like a 6-word novel. So 4 words, how would you sum this book up?
Entertaining,
Mhm.
exciting, engaging, and empathetic. So 4 E's.
I like the onomatopoeia,
Okay. Well, I mean, David mentioned that,
alliteration.
yeah, we often share thoughts. So I'm going to try to articulate mine using different words. So I would say riveting, uh, real, heartbreaking,
Mm.
and
Joyful. Say
joy
joyful.
joyful. I was going to say joyful. I was joyfully inspiring. I'm gonna cheat.
Okay.
You could cheat. That's allowed. That's allowed. I like it. Um, well, I really do appreciate both of you for coming to the session and answering the questions that I had for you and just really diving into the work and helping me understand it a little bit more. What are your final thoughts for both of you and encouragement for aspiring creators and readers?
I would say read a lot of books, and what you do is you go to the library, right? Because if your budget is tight, support your local library. It has gotten me through some of the most difficult times of my life. My local library, even though I have a stack of books here that are all overdue, um, but read everything, anything and everything, and find the things that not only inspire you, but some of those things, like with me, with the Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, reading it as a much younger person, and just sort of asking the question, why is this guy going down river with this white kid, right? Like, why isn't he going north? That was the thing that was the
Mhm.
question that stood out in my mind, and years later, decades later, that led to the creation of this book.
Yep. And for me, I would say, yeah, read. Just learn your craft, whatever your storytelling craft may be. Put your time, effort into really learning how to do it in order to tell your stories effectively, and then really take some time with yourself to know yourself enough to know what your stories are that you want to tell, and tell them, with honesty and integrity, and you'll be good.
Thank you guys for that. We're right on time, and I want to thank everyone for attending and leave you with the final thought to one, read everything and get to know yourself so you can tell your story. Um, we're gonna end there. Thank you for coming and keep on reading.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.